What's up, guys? If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, please smash that like button on the video and enjoy the show.
We are all these empires, and if this empire grows, then we will shrink, and therefore we have to team up with these guys to keep everything in balance. But it's more or less that kind of thinking.
Well, you were saying right before we were on camera, a little sideways here, but I think this is kind of cool. Yeah. You were living over in the Soviet bloc, like when communism fell.
Oh yeah.
So you've done a lot of your early work was surrounding like European history and vis-a-vis politics, right?
It was. So I mean, I'm of the vintage. I graduated from high school in 1987, and back then it was Perestroika and Glasnost. Mikhail Gorbachev was maybe changing the Soviet Union. Right. In my generation, we'd all grown up with the Cold War and the possibility of nuclear destruction and, all that idea. And suddenly there seemed to be a real thawing going on in the Soviet Union. And I thought that was interesting, and maybe that would result in some kind of changes and would define our times. So as an 18-year-old, I kind of gravitated in college to Soviet East European studies. And it so happened my junior year abroad, I went to Budapest in his exchange program at the Karl Marx University of Economic Sciences.
You went abroad into the belly of the beast.
Into the belly of the beast, and it happened to be the fall of 1989. So when I arrived, it was communism, and while I was there, it all collapsed. Berlin Wall, fall of Ceausescu, Hungary leaving the bloc, Velvet Revolution. And, as Americans, we needed visas way ahead of time. You had to stand in lines at the Polish embassy to get your visa, and then you had to go to the Czechoslovak embassy to get a transit visa to take the train to Poland and come back 3 days later and pay. I mean, you didn't do anything spur of the moment. You had to plan everything a week or two ahead of time to go to these other Soviet bloc countries. But just by the luck of the draw, I happened to have the right visas and the right trips so that I saw a lot of those events firsthand, from the late days of Ceausescu to the Velvet Revolution to being in Berlin just a few days after the wall had opened up. And we were coming from Budapest, right? So we were coming to East Berlin.
Whoa.
And then we had a East German transit visas to go visit West Berlin, but we were arriving with all the East Germans who are going to see the West for the first time in their lives. And we're with them being pulled off the trains.
What was that like?
Oh, Lichtenberg Station in East Berlin when we arrived was, it was so mobbed, the train had to stop well before it could enter the station because all the platforms had become overwhelmed and people had filled the rails in between. And so it was being pressed like sardines coming off all of the trains. Everyone's flowing towards the subway stations under the train station to go to the West. And we were just caught up in this sort of ocean of people just kind of flowing like sardines being sucked down the passages, actually in the direction where we weren't supposed to go there because you couldn't enter as a non-Soviet bloc citizen, but it was just chaos.
What are they gonna do? Check you?
Right. They're like, goodbye. Holding up, other people's children so they don't get crushed, kind of thing.
Whoa.
And just flowing through with all these people going to see the other world on the other side of the wall for the first time. So that was absolutely crazy. Then we get to West Berlin and put down our bags and then get a visiting day visa to go cross Checkpoint Charlie into East Berlin at the same time that all the East Berlinese are leaving. And it was, all of those things were amazing and led me to stay, to go back the next summer. And then as soon as I graduated, I went back to Eastern Europe to see how that was all going to play out. So I was there for most of my 20s, which were most of the 1990s.
In Budapest?
Budapest and later Zagreb and Sarajevo. I was covering the region and became a journalist because, I figured out that being a reporter, I wanted to see what was going to happen.
So you're there at the fall of the Balkans.
Yeah, I was there for the whole thing and was the Christian Science Monitor and San Francisco Chronicle's immediate post-war correspondent for former Yugoslavia. So I was there, first elections and, the city was destroyed, when I first went to Sarajevo. You had to go in and out on...
Can you pull that up on a map, Alessi, Sarajevo?
Yeah, you had to go in and out on... The airport was closed because it had been shelled and destroyed and was controlled by NATO. So as a journalist, you could fly with the C-130s in who were doing the reprovisioning. So it's like landing in C-130s with a whole bunch of, French Marines and getting off in sandbags and, machine guns and all that kind of stuff. And then going into a city that was... there were no windows, the skyscrapers, the top halves are all burned out because they've been shelled and, water for 1 hour a day and, landmines in all the parks. And, it was immediate aftermath of that. And, I guess this is all important in that it shaped being in that region throughout the transition from communism, from, these countries that
One
were
thing to call it transition.
Yeah,
Hell of a transition.
a super transition from totalitarian regimes trying to become liberal democracies, maybe in places where they'd never been liberal democracies, or the last time they were was in the 1930s, which had its own problems in Europe in that time period.
All these separate ethnicities too, who had all been put together, kind of, and now they're not.
All their history of animosity and grudges and having done terrible things to one another had been put on ice in the Soviet period. You're all fraternal socialist allies. You, the Hungarians and the Romanians, you're all now socialist friends with your big cousins in Moscow helping guide the way. That was all becoming thawed out very rapidly. And there were all kinds of potential conflicts and demagogues trying to use those situations to stay in power. You know, there's a guy named Vladimir Mečiar who was trying to do it in Slovakia. There was Jan Iliescu in Romania. And then Milosevic is the one who really succeeded, I guess, in generating a whole little, genocide and horror show war in the heart of Europe. In 1991, this kicks off.
Yeah.
The post-Cold War peace was extremely short and was kind of the whole idea of a new Europe, a unified Europe was kind of stillborn right then. But for me, that was like a laboratory for propaganda, tropes of nationhood, how demagogues function, how you brainwash populations, fear, war, othering people, fascism. I mean, there were little fascist regimes, like Franjo Tudjman's Croatia when I was covering that. So it was a laboratory for really understanding the way people and societies work in and the power of history and how history can be used and abused.
Oh, yeah.
And, I guess I tell this story because then when I went back to the U.S. and was traveling around, I started realizing that our own, the U.S. is kind of balkanized, right? We have separate, there were separate colonial projects and they had separate regional cultures and they ended up together in kind of an accident of history. And the Pirate book and many of the other books I did early on were delving into colonial history and giving more and more of the background to kind of understand how history plays and influences events in contemporary U.S. life, right? So that's the relevance of what was happening in the Balkans to what is happening now in the United States is unfortunately pretty closely linked. So
interesting. Well, if we got stuck on the Balkans, we'd be there all day because I'm so interested in that. Like that was something. It's a quick aside. Like maybe 2.5 years ago, I saw an old Time cover from the NATO bombings in '99.
Oh, Kosovo,
yeah. And I was like, what the fuck is that?
Right.
And I went to Google and I went, whoa! And I started researching this. And then I had my friend Beck Lover, who lost 28 people in the genocide over there. He's Albanian, but also has family from Kosovo who are Albanians, obviously. And it just blew me away how much of that history we don't know about. And yet so many of our GWOT guys, our Global War on Terror, Navy SEAL Special Forces guys, you go listen to their stories, 1 time out of 2, you're going to have a guy say, yeah, so my first deployment, Kosovo, 99, and they all know about it, but it's not covered here. The genocide in Bosnia and what Serbia was doing to so many people, it's not really talked about. So, that's definitely something I want to cover on future podcasts. That's another, you and I were talking about some other topics you covered that are future podcasts. That might be another one right there.
Happy to do that.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.